Here's the music you won't hear. On the news, you ran into a coyote?
I have seen 4 coyotes in San Francisco, my big urban city here.
Animals taking over in your area. Lines are open now at 1-800-300-KFOG. Let's play some music. Here's the music you won't
Across the city, a small hill beckons. Floating above the elegant grid of city streets, it is a raft of abundant life. These animals have learned to flourish in the nooks and crannies of this urban landscape. And now, a new animal has joined their ranks. As the city grapples with what it means to live with this new large carnivore and how to coexist with it safely, we learn from scientists in other cities how coyotes impact urban ecosystems and how they and other wild creatures survive in the challenging sanctuary of the American city. Our story begins on this tiny patch of urban parkland, because it is here, on this most unlikely spot, that the coyote has marked its return to San Francisco after an absence of more than 30 years. Anna Cooperberg was one of the first people to see the coyote.
The first time I saw the coyote was August of 2003, and it was around this area. I was walking up this way with my dog, Slidell, and the coyote just ran down the hill, ran across the street, and ran down the other side. It happened so fast, I didn't even know what it was. I thought it was a fox. I bring my camera a lot up here because I'm a photographer and I photograph dogs. My dog and all the other dogs up here too. So I wanted to get some pictures of the coyote.
Anna's photos give us a rare glimpse of the coyote's early behaviors on Bernal Hill. Its willingness to be out in broad daylight, near houses and people, and its remarkable response to the ever-present dogs on the hill.
I did notice this scene where a herding dog came right up to her, barked, circled around her, and she just looked at it and yawned. I mean, she literally just stretched and yawned. One of the weirdest things to me is, how did she get there? To get to Bernal Hill, you have to cross miles of busy streets, San Francisco streets.
Adrift in this urban sea, Bernal Hill is a 24-acre patch of native coastal grassland at the southern end of San Francisco.
How did this wily creature make it and survive on Bernal Hill? in a highly urban setting. It's almost like a little island of habitat. The food supply of mammals is pretty high in some of these areas. There's a major supply of pocket gophers that any gardener can tell you that they're dealing with. These animals are generalists, and so it probably fed on other things. The coyote among the canid group and the dog group is extremely smart and adaptable. And so potentially it was cruising in the night when people didn't see it. It was cruising in edges of the city, on the roads, on the right-of-ways. It was cruising in the backyards. It was obviously making and navigating with our cars, but amazingly enough, making it to Bernal Hill. So I think it's remarkable.
On this tiny urban oasis, the coyote would have found unexpected relief and unexpected advantages as well. Rising almost 500 feet above the floor of San Francisco, Bernal Hill is built on layer after layer of red rock chert, formed in the warmer waters of a distant sea more than 100 million years ago. From the protection of these high slopes, creatures can easily see the early approach of danger. And once here, they find support in a surprisingly robust ecosystem, thanks to the devotion of a small group of volunteers who have protected and maintained this hill for decades. Carefully tended and preserved, Bernal Hill today sustains a great variety of wild plant and animal lives. And now, the existence of this small island of habitat has made it possible for this coyote to reclaim the territory of its ancestors, which vanished from this landscape more than 30 years ago. But this was not the first coyote to find its way back. The first reports of coyotes came more than 2 years earlier from surprised residents of the Presidio district, just 2 miles from downtown San Francisco. The Presidio is a former military base that is now the largest urban national park in the United States. In this 1,500-acre wilderness preserve at the northern tip of San Francisco, park tenants share habitat with wildlife. The earliest coyote sightings came from a Presidio neighborhood called Tennessee Hollow.
There were some reports of pet cats missing, and park visitors claimed that they saw a coyote, but we've had gray fox here for centuries, and red fox showed up a few years ago. So we weren't 100% sure that these sightings were accurate.
Pretty sure it was a coyote about the size of a small German Shepherd, by the 14th. He was a small one. It looked really small. He was running down the side of the road, so I yelled and screamed and scared him into the bushes.
Just wanted to say that I did see one of the coyotes several weeks ago, actually, just sitting on Silent Blue again. Maybe 8 o'clock at night. It didn't move, and I just kept walking.
We've started hearing a lot of reports of people seeing coyotes at twilight or at dusk. And we didn't take them real seriously because a coyote can look like a small German shepherd or a large fox, and we weren't really sure.
Some of the earlier reports of coyote sightings, in hindsight, are kind of humorous. This one was from February 2003. Today, one of the National Guard stationed at Fort Point spotted 3 of what he said were wolves. This sighting was sometime in the early morning in the headlights of their Hummer when they turned off Lincoln Boulevard. They thought they saw what were 3 wolves, which we never actually confirmed whether they were fox or coyotes, but we're pretty sure that they weren't wolves.
In late 2002, photos started coming in, showing a coyote in backyards and head deep in a gopher hole.
Then we really initiated a lot of work. We started a study to see exactly how the behavior of this coyote might be occurring. Does it spend most of its time in the Presidio? Does it go outside of the Presidio? How it reacts with the other predators on the Presidio, the skunks, raccoons, foxes. So we started to try to look at all of these small predators called mesocarnivores to see how they react to each other around the Presidio and to be able to better manage them.
Captured in humane traps, these small predators were fitted with radio collars and released back into their Presidio habitat. From their radio signals, the research team would build a picture of the animal's territories and behavior patterns. When it came time to capture the coyote, they were helped by the experience of wildlife ecologist Aaron Boydston, who had captured and studied coyotes in nearby Marin County.
So we wanted to look at the movements of this particular individual and see how it was making a living in this parkland, urbanized area. You know, where did it move within the Presidio? How far did it range? Where did it travel when it left the Presidio? Did it move along the coastline, or did it just stay in that area?
The research team began tracking the coyote's movements around the park, and the barest picture began to emerge. But after about 10 days, the signal disappeared, and so did the coyote.
We were disappointed when the coyote disappeared and we couldn't find it. But we were able to learn some important things from the experience altogether, and one of them was that that wasn't the only coyote that was in the Presidio.
A second coyote was sighted right after the first one disappeared. It had no radio collar and no ear tag.
And while we were radio tracking, driving all over the streets of San Francisco, around Golden Gate Park, we started hearing reports of a coyote that was being seen around Bernal Hill. And also there were some articles in the San Francisco Chronicle with a photograph. So we began looking to that area as a possible place that our radio-collared animal might have moved into. It was a surprising place that a coyote would take up residence. It's a pretty small hill. It doesn't have much vegetation or cover on it, and it's very isolated. But a coyote that made it to Bernal Hill probably was an individual looking for a suitable territory or habitat to set up a home range and establish a residence, maybe even potentially find a mate. Given the other options adjacent to Bernal Hill, that probably appeared as the best option, and coyotes tend to surprise us with what they are able to do sometimes.
The team never found their missing coyote, but they did discover something else. That the recolonization of San Francisco by coyotes had begun. And the lost coyote left something behind as well.
One of the most important things we learned from the coyote that we captured in the Presidio came from its blood. We took a blood sample when we captured it, and I sent that blood sample to a colleague at UC Davis.
At the University of California at Davis, researchers had compiled a database on coyote populations throughout the state, with their different genetic structures mapped out by region. The Presidio team hoped the coyote's DNA would tell them which population it came from.
We assumed it had come probably from the south because there was a land connection. Otherwise, to the north, you've got ocean and the bay and massive amounts of water.
And another four-legged animal in the study had already proved this was possible: the red fox. Not a native of San Francisco, the red fox has nevertheless been here for several years now. To study its impact on the more elusive gray fox, which is a native of San Francisco, the research team captured and tracked this red fox. After about a year, it also disappeared, only to reappear, first in Daly City, about 10 miles to the south. Then north again at the San Francisco Zoo, before disappearing once more, heading south. The southern route seemed a natural one for the coyote as well, but its blood proved otherwise. Its DNA showed clearly it had come from a population north of the Golden Gate Bridge, even north of Marin County.
This was completely surprising. This was not something we had really considered. And that left the question of how did the coyote get into the Presidio? And we checked with wildlife rehabilitators in the area to see if anybody had recently rehabilitated a coyote and maybe there had been one that had been released, and nobody had had any. Coyotes are very hard to capture. It seemed unlikely that if somebody had captured a coyote elsewhere that they would have then brought it into the Presidio. To us, the simplest explanation for how this coyote had made its way into the Presidio was that it had simply walked and traveled across the Golden Gate Bridge, which leads directly into the Presidio.
What this means is that the Golden Gate Bridge has made it possible for two genetically separate coyote populations to mix for possibly the first time. As surprising as this sounds, it is not the first time that wildlife has used the bridge as a travel corridor. This deer astonished bridge commuters in 2004 as it raced ahead of traffic from Marin to San Francisco before finally disappearing into the green freedom of the Presidio.
So corridors are really valuable to these urban habitats. Sometimes we've had a really hard time wildlife getting across even just streets. So making sure there's linkages through the habitats so that the animals can get to fresh water without being seen or feeling comfortable in their cover. And also linkages to other areas. The coyotes are fascinating animals because they're able to adapt so well to urban life. And they'll find these corridors. They don't mind being on a sidewalk for a little while or on a street for a little while, and in backyards. And so a lot of the corridors end up being through backyards. So there are some really valuable ways that these wildlife can link from green space to green space in these urban habitats.
But probably no animal has stretched our idea of corridors more than the humble quail. The California quail is the state bird of California. It is also the official bird of San Francisco, although few can be found here today. Remarkably, the quail proved that even this heavily used boulevard could work as a travel corridor for wildlife. It could be said that this grassy chain of street medians led this nearly flightless bird one step away from the edge of extinction in San Francisco, at least for now.
The quail are clearly at a crossroads in San Francisco. The California quail have been diminishing numbers and pretty drastically in the past couple of decades. But they're part of the history of this place. They were once in every neighborhood of the city. The call of the quail part of the larger soundscape of this place that we now call San Francisco.
By 1999, the Audubon Society counted fewer than 60 quail in all of San Francisco, half of them behind these houses in this Presidio neighborhood.
Some species are more sensitive to habitat than others. The quail are a little more sensitive in that they need enough habitat for cover and for food. And since just about everything that predates on other animals also eats quail, the quail really have the cards stacked against them. So what we've been doing since then primarily has been habitat restoration. This site just 3 years ago was a football field of ice plant.
With the help of volunteers, they removed the ice plant and replaced it with thousands of plants representing 35 native dune species to provide dense undergrowth for cover and escape from ground predators. They also put colored bands on the quail's legs to learn how they move around the park and survive from year to year. That's how they discovered the quail's remarkable journey.
And one of the interesting things that we learned from the color banding is that 2 of our quail have actually left the Presidio during nesting season, and they not only survived the trip all the way to Golden Gate Park, which is about 8 very busy city blocks, they found one of the only other quail populations in the city, which is in the Arboretum in Golden Gate Park. One of those males is still there, and as of last summer is now the proud papa of a new family of chicks, and I think most of those chicks have survived.
The deep biological drive that leads animals on dangerous journeys to untried territory is called dispersal.
In order to survive and reproduce, animals eventually need to establish a home range of their own, and some animals stick close to home. They stay close to where they're born. But other animals, generally males in a lot of mammal species, tend to disperse long distances. That is, they leave where they're born and they move to a new area and set up a new home range or territory where they can find the resources they need to survive and reproduce. With a lot of animals, there's problems when populations get isolated and potentially inbred. So individuals that might disperse from one population to another carry their genes into the new population, and that allows for at least there to be gene flow between the populations. Even just a few individuals moving back and forth and reproducing allows those populations to stay genetically connected, which can help the populations persist into the future longer because they're less prone to the negative impacts of inbreeding, and they're more resilient and resistant to changes in the environment.
It is probably the drive to disperse that brought a black bear to the very foot of the Golden Gate Bridge in 2003. Its surprising arrival at Kirby Cove was actually the end of a 10-day spree that began 40 miles to the north in Sonoma County. The bear made its way down to the southern tip of the Marin Peninsula, smashing garbage cans and raiding beehives before vanishing on Mount Tamalpais. It left a few items behind: several large paw prints like the ones on this dumpster, and a hair that confirmed it was a male. The bear's wanderlust overtook him during the black bear's mating season in May, just 3 months before the coyote showed up on Bernal Hill.
What does it mean for large carnivores to be moving across these kinds of landscapes? Generally, large carnivores and humans don't tend to coexist well. We've managed to extirpate them from a lot of landscapes in the US and around the world. Now we're trying to add them back in, such as in Yellowstone is a great example, with wolves being reintroduced there. But we're still learning how to live with these animals, especially in urban areas. As we change our landscapes and as they get pushed out of areas where they've been present, animals continue to surprise us as they try to adapt. And carnivores, no matter how well we do with preserving them within the parklands, they require large areas to meet their basic ecological needs. And individuals are going to disperse and move out of these areas. What do they do when they move outside these lands? How do we coexist with them? How do we maintain these animals? And how do we address human concerns? We're still learning.
This was the first bear to visit Marin County in more than a century, but it probably won't be the last. According to the Department of Fish and Game, black bear populations in California have grown from 10,000 to 35,000 since 1985, and their range has expanded as well. The coyote's range has also increased, in spite of decades of lethal predator control efforts, mostly to protect livestock and ranching interests.
Many people don't realize that the coyote is the most persecuted carnivore in the United States today. We've been systematically killing coyotes for over a century. Our federal government actually subsidizes lethal predator control, and each year in the United States there are at least 75,000 coyotes that are killed by the federal government. And this doesn't include the coyotes that are killed by ranchers, by trappers, hunters, by poisoning, aerial gunning. Despite this, over the last century, we've seen their populations grow and their range also expand.
The coyote's territory has grown threefold since the 1850s. This creature of the western plains can now be found from Alaska to Panama and eastward across North America. Efforts to reduce their populations may actually have led to their increase, according to several scientific studies.
Coyote populations generally have stable family structures. There's generally an alpha pair that do both the breeding and also the provisioning of the pups. So when there's some sort of artificial exploitation of that pack through hunting, poisoning, trapping, whatever, this will disrupt that family structure. And what that means is that you may end up having more females that will then breed. So not just your alpha pair, now you have what are called the betas that may actually breed as well, thus potentially increasing the population.
According to Fox, coyotes can also breed more often and increase their litter size in response to population pressure such as hunting. And when a coyote is removed from a territory, others will move in to fill that ecological void. This understanding of coyote biology is at the heart of a pilot program in Marin County, where many ranchers are participating in a non-lethal predator control program to keep coyotes away from their livestock. On the Jensen Ranch, where lambing season is now underway, these newborns are protected by electric fencing provided by the program.
What we're going to be doing here right now is I'm going to be checking this electric wire. It's predator wire is what we call it. It's up off the ground about 6 inches, and this deters a coyote or a predator from trying to dig underneath the fence. You don't want to touch that wire because it'll definitely give you a little tingle, more than a tingle. I've just cleaned off my fence line and I've got it all mowed and ready because lambing season's here now, and now's the time that we start to experience our most dramatic predator problems.
Jensen joined the program because simply killing coyotes wasn't saving enough of his lambs.
I'm going to go back about 10 years ago. I lost as many as 50 head in a year, 50 lambs in a year. Other people lost hundreds, you know, so it was becoming a huge problem. Some people sold out, went out of business. Some people adapted. I basically decided that I was going to have to keep myself in business if anything was going to happen.
Dogs provided by the program now guard his livestock full-time, as do llamas, which will aggressively attack any dog-like creature. "5 years into the program, livestock losses are well down, and Bill Jensen is pleased with the extra tools he now has for dealing with a very challenging predator.
Since I can't be here all night long trying to guard sheep from coyotes, this serves me 24/7. To me, this is my most effective tool. It's cut my losses probably by 75 to 80%, and it's probably kept more coyotes off our back than anything. So it helps. It's not the end-all for everything that goes on with the sheep business, but it's more than we had before, and it's a help.
Coyotes that don't find their way around the program's defenses are allowed to remain in the area and, ironically, contribute to the program's success.
Because they're territorial animals, they'll essentially keep out the other coyotes that could be real problems. So the goal should be to try to figure out a way to implement methods so that you keep the coyotes that aren't a problem, that don't predate on your sheep or your livestock. Because what we've realized, and the scientists have realized, is that whether you love coyotes or you hate them, the reality is that they're here to stay.
Unique among large predators, coyotes have shown that they can live in any environment, even fragmented urbanized ecosystems, and side by side with humans. As development and urban sprawl channel more and more of these animals out of the countryside, they are showing up in places that are well outside their historical range, including New York City. Jumping through this fence in Central Park, this coyote became famous in 2006 for its ability to elude capture. At this point, the coyote had already been chased by police and Parks Department officials for about an hour and a half. Finding his way through yet another fence, the coyote finally escaped once again into the vast northern expanses of Central Park. It took 2 days and dozens of city employees to capture this coyote. But this is not the usual fate that awaits most urban coyotes. For the most part, as these living symbols of the American wilderness tumble into our urban landscapes, they find new safety from animal protection laws and new attitudes from humans. For coyotes and other wild creatures, the American city has become a new safe haven.
I feel like there is a definite resurgence of wildlife in San Francisco. We have a refuge here in the city that ironically might be safer or provide more food than some of the wild areas. From the point of view of having a biodiversity expansion, we're seeing different birds come back. We're seeing animals given a chance with habitat restoration to come back. We're seeing certainly plants and other systems coming back, which has provided home and habitat for water birds, shorebirds, and migrating birds and other wildlife associated with that. These animals are coming in and finding little teeny pockets of safe zones and are breeding and are having the ability to actually deal with being with people. There's been this selection that has eliminated the ones who couldn't deal with that or didn't survive. And if they're not being hunted for food, then they can kind of tolerate it. So if you go into the park, you'll see a great blue heron just hanging out there, and it's not flying away when you walk up to it. They're tolerating the human observation because they're not being harassed to the point of needing to fly or be fleshed.
While this selection process affects newcomers and natives alike, some species have profited more than others. Raccoons, for example, which number well over 1,000 in the city today. But their success comes at a cost to other urban species.
Very much the top predator in San Francisco in terms of the mammal group, in terms of its impact. They'll eat anything from your garbage to the quail eggs, the tree frogs, and the red-legged frogs that we have in our city. And it's a management issue because they are a native, but they are so adaptable and do so well in our disturbed habitats where people are, what people provide. And so they're on their way to kind of like the city of raccoons, as it were, you know. They come out at night and they hunt in teams, and they can go anywhere, whichever way. They dig through the water, they'll turn over the ponds.
Backyard habitats are crucial to the survival of many wild creatures of the city. They have certainly helped this small flock of parrots keep a toehold in San Francisco. This flock adopted the backyards and parklands at the southern end of the city about 20 years ago, according to the author of the book, The Wild Parrots of Telegraph Hill.
The flock got started in the early 70s. They're called canary-winged parakeets, and they actually flew the Telegraph Hill area. That's why I was confused. And then when this flock started breeding, the cherry-head conure flock, and that was in 1989, they kicked that other flock out of this area, and they haven't been back since then.
The two flocks have carved San Francisco into separate territories, with the canary wings migrating to the southern end of the city and the cherryheads holding on to the northern waterfront. Both flocks are wild parrot species from South America.
They're both here because there used to be a trade in wild-caught birds. It's illegal now, but they used to bring up wild-caught parrots, trap them in the wild, ship them up here and sell them to pet stores. And I think in a lot of cases, you know, people didn't realize that when you buy a pet bird, they're really, you know, one of these wild-caught birds, they really are wild, and they were screaming and biting. I'm sure people just threw them away. There may have also been accidental releases, and enough of the same species found each other that they started breeding. I would say the most important aspect of their survival here is gardening. I mean, that's what the parrots are eating. In the gardens, there's something planted at all times of year. There's always something for them to eat. Yeah, there they go, come overhead now. And that's the main thing. They find plenty of food to eat. There are a lot of trees that they eat from that have something for them in the winter, such as blossoms. They eat the wild blackberries, you know, pears, apples. If they're not food specific, which both of these species are not, I mean, they're opportunistic eaters. They'll eat anything that looks good. So there's always something for them.
In their waterfront territory, the cherryheads have done well and have grown to a flock of about 200. The canary wings number around 40. Some of them roost in Dolores Park, where high in this date palm they rest. while the San Francisco Opera performs a free concert below. It is now July, nearly 40 years after their unexpected release into this foreign landscape. It is the season, once again, for a new generation to hatch. The dense fertility of San Francisco's urban ecosystem has made it a national hotspot for biodiversity. How coyotes will impact this rich mix of life has yet to be written, but clues can already be seen in the Presidio.
One of the benefits that the coyote and these predators provide is they keep the populations of smaller mammals in check. So they provide a service to almost the landscaping of the Presidio as well. For example, gophers. The coyote really is able to reduce gopher populations.
Studies from other cities also show the importance of coyotes to the health of urban ecosystems.
Over the last 10 years, scientists are really starting to see how vital a coyote can be to an ecosystem. They can actually be the largest carnivore in a particular ecosystem, which almost functioning as what's called a keystone predator. And in fact, one study that looked at coyotes living in fragmented habitats in San Diego showed that when coyotes were lethally removed from the area, it resulted in an increase in mesocarnivores like skunks, raccoons, opossums, feral cats. Their numbers proliferated. They then had a devastating impact on the ground nesting bird species. And so it can then have this very negative effect on the whole ecosystem.
But to really understand what it means to live with coyotes, our story now moves to Chicago, where more than 2,000 coyotes live today. In this city, coyotes have begun to have an impact on urban geese, whose explosive population growth has been a tough management issue for the city. But as coyotes eat the goose eggs, these populations have declined, and in some areas, they are leaving altogether. Stan Gert has captured and radio-collared almost 200 coyotes in Chicago to learn how they live in an urban setting and coexist with humans. He was surprised to find how many of them live right next to people.
There's almost always a solitary animal near people, anywhere you go. And they're always silent, and they're almost always nocturnal. So in that case, people won't realize that there's coyotes living right next to them.
These beeps come from the radio collar of a coyote resting in this small group of trees in a Chicago neighborhood.
Some of the things that we've learned from radio tracking these coyotes over the years are that they're very successful in this urban landscape, partly because they're very flexible about how they use different habitats.
On his research rounds, Gert has picked up coyotes' radio signals next to shopping malls and dental offices, and in the landscaped islands of parking lots. The best predictor of the presence of coyotes is water.
Usually anywhere you develop an area, you have to put water somewhere, and the coyotes use those areas quite heavily. We also find that some of the coyotes will use some of the main thoroughfares for travel lanes just like we do. So many of the big interstates or highways will have an easement next to them where you can't build right next to the road. Well, that small amount of ground is actually used quite heavily by the coyotes, both for hunting as well as for traveling. So they are using all parts of the landscape, which we didn't know they were doing because they become very nocturnal and very secretive and hard to see. So that's one of the adjustments coyotes have made to living in an urban area.
According to Gert's research, coyotes have divided Chicago into territories. Packs of up to 6 adults can range as much as 9 square miles. Solitary coyotes cross hundreds of roads each night in ranges that average 28 square miles. An analysis of their diet shows they rely on many of the same prey animals as they do in the countryside, including deer. In areas where deer have eaten out much of the habitat, coyotes have thinned these populations. They also eat fruit, rodents, and rabbits. This night vision footage taken from Gert's research truck shows coyotes hunting next to a busy roadway where the noise of nearby traffic does not seem to distract them. After 7 years of research, what Gert has learned about coyotes in Chicago has transformed his view of this animal.
I underestimated their ability to adjust to human-dominated landscapes. I also underestimated their ability to actually control the situation, because as humans, we are used to being in charge and affecting other wildlife species or animals. With the coyote, that's an animal that we've been trying to control for almost 200 years. And we haven't had much success out in the country, and now they're beginning to teach us that we don't have a lot of hope as far as controlling them overall in the city as well.
For city dwellers who see a coyote, Gert has this advice: don't approach it, don't feed it. Let it stay wild, self-sufficient, and with a healthy fear of humans. Unfortunately, this line was crossed in San Francisco in July of 2007. Near this path in Golden Gate Park, a male and female coyote pair that had reportedly been fed by humans threatened several dogs and injured one of them. 2 days later, near this same path, the coyotes were shot and killed by the California Department of Fish and Game. The response from residents was clear.
I would say overwhelmingly it's been negative. Whether or not we could have done it differently or not, that's what we're doing right now. I mean, this is not like the Serengeti where you tranquilize an animal and you can follow them for 20 miles until they drop down. An animal that's tranquilized or shot with a tranquilizer agent, chances are it's going to run in the street. As you know, Golden Gate Park, there's some very busy thoroughfares right out there. We don't want the animal getting hit by a car. We don't want the animal causing any accidents at all. Public health and safety is our #1 priority, but we want to make sure that, basically these coyotes or any wildlife that lives in San Francisco, that we just don't dispatch it because it becomes a nuisance. We've got to educate the public. We've put out flyers on what to do, what not to do. We've got to get a flavor for where these animals are, how many we're talking about. I mean, basically, this was something new to us, but we've got to be more proactive than we've been in the past. In the past, we've been more reactive. Obviously, we've got this wildlife here in San Francisco, and really the idea is to coexist with it. In order to coexist with it, we've got to educate the public. We've got to educate them. Don't try and tame these animals. Don't feed these animals. Don't make them become your friend or dependent upon you, because if you do, you're actually signing their death warrant.
This was the first attack by coyotes since they returned here in 2001. In that same time period, there have been 660 attacks by dogs, serious enough to end up in vicious and dangerous dog hearings. In Friedman's view, the decision to coexist with wild creatures of the city will ultimately rest with the citizens of San Francisco, where the penalties have been upgraded for feeding wild creatures. Meanwhile, across town in the Presidio, a family of coyotes had also been sighted. To avoid conflicts, the Presidio sent letters to park residents and posted signage in areas where the animals had been seen. Elsewhere in the Presidio, coyotes continue their work on San Francisco's ecosystem. But there are other reasons to appreciate their presence here.
It gives people a sense of wonder. How did this get here? Wow, I live in the city and there's this amazing animal here. Just that moment takes you out of where you are. It gives you pause and brings you back into the here and now, into the moment. The moment that, that we've all been waiting for, so to speak, but the moment that we evolved from. And it's suggesting possibly that there maybe is a sustainable food supply for some of these unusual wild creatures, suggesting that there is a healthy habitat for animals and for people alike. And so if we start to realize that our own health depends on our backyards for being clean and free of pollution and having fresh air, then I think that we'll start to care whether we see these animals there or not as well.
So that coyotes can remain a part of the natural world of the Presidio, park residents are asked to keep pet food off porches and cats indoors, and always have dogs on a leash. This wildlife education is constant and ongoing.
Just this week, there were coyotes hunting right on the lawn right out here, and some seniors actually took refuge in the bowling alley, so we'll have to make sure that they know that coyotes actually are more afraid of them than they are of the coyotes. And there's an off-leash dog.
Coyotes were once a vital part of the landscape of San Francisco. Their return provides a living link to the ancient natural heritage of this place. As more and more of these unusual creatures find their way into our cities and make a place for themselves among us, they bring us something as well. A chance to reconsider our place in the natural world and our relationship with wild nature. Four years have passed since the radio-collared coyote disappeared. Coyotes have now been seen in almost every corner of the city today. The quail of Golden Gate Park have succeeded once again and delivered 2 new groups of hatchlings to the city of San Francisco. And this coyote can still sometimes be seen on Bernal Hill.